name is Tony Wood and I am the Energy Program Director for Grattan Institute. Firstly, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet this evening, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. This evening is a non-trivial issue that we're discussing. And in some ways it goes to some fairly deep issues, and some I'm sure might even be somewhat trivial as we get into the discussion, and we'll see how things go. But there are some significant challenges, and so what we're going to do this evening is open up a discussion about a topic which could become very mathematical or very emotional. And the issue is really, what should Australia's post-2020 targets be? This evening we're we are very happy to have two people to join me to have this discussion. One of them is Charlene Thompson. Charlene is the acting CEO of the Climate Change Authority. Now, setting targets post-2020 is so important that the Australian government has allocated two groups to basically do exactly the same thing, and Charlene will explain how that's going to work. Charlene's been in this job only a relatively short time, so she's got a challenge, but she is probably one of the most experienced bureaucrats in the country on these issues to do with environment and climate change policy. Charlene will go through and explain exactly what the Climate Change Authority is doing and discuss in particular their draft report on what Australia's targets should be. The second speaker who's joining me is Erwin Jackson. Erwin is the Deputy CEO of the Climate Institute. The Climate Institute is one of the most respected independent advocates for climate change policy in the country, and Erwin does in particular has been doing a lot of work not only domestically looking at climate change policy for well over a decade, but also has been heavily involved with Australia's activities internationally, because the way Australia sets targets is also not just a domestic issue, but it's also an international issue. And Erwin will put it in perspective in that regard as well. So we'll have the presentations, we'll then have a bit of a discussion about some of the issues between the three of us, and if we all survive that without hitting each other, then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and our objective is to finish pretty much at 8 o'clock. So hopefully you will have enough information to ask all sorts of interesting questions, and if we don't have questions, I've got quite a few that have already been submitted in writing from people who may be in this room or not, and we'll go to those as well. So I don't think we've never yet had a problem with running out of questions on the topics that we discuss here in this room. So what I wanted to do very briefly is use just a couple of slides to illustrate why I and the work we've been doing at Grattan thinks this is an important enough issue to dedicate an evening of our lives to thinking seriously about how we might influence what's going to happen in this regard. I think Australia has a very high national interest in a global response to climate change for several reasons, and we have in some ways almost an unusually high level of national interest. Firstly, we are a member of the global community, and in that global community Australia has an unusually high greenhouse gas footprint, and it turns out as a result of that we are now on the wrong side of what's called a market failure. That is, a market failure in this situation is where those who damage others by emitting greenhouse gases generally do not pay for the damage. So when the market works to correct that market failure, then someone pays for the damage, ideally those who did the damage in the first place. And so that is one of the reasons why we have an interest in this, the way the global community responds to this, because it will have an impact on us. Secondly, we are an energy export superpower. In 3 or 4 years' time, we may very well be the largest exporter of LNG, and we're already one of the largest exporters of coal, and there are several times more greenhouse gases in the fossil fuels we export than the greenhouse gases we actually emit within Australia. But if the world acts on its commitment to limit global average temperature increases to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, then the global share of energy in the world drops from about 80% by fossil fuels, drops from about 80% today to less than 60% by 2030, 2040. And that is significant if you're interested in Australia's export earnings, And while Joe Hockey may very well not be the Treasurer in 2030 or 2040, somebody will be, and they may have a significant issue about balancing budgets. Thirdly, Australia is a country that will be severely impacted by unmitigated climate change. I won't bore you with the science of that. That's a topic that I'm sure many of you have already heard about and don't need convincing on that regard. And finally and fourthly, we have an urgent need for domestic clarity around domestic policy on climate change. The recently released Energy White Paper, it was released only a couple of weeks ago by the federal government, basically said that the government is committed to maintaining stable and predictable policy settings. If you look at climate change policy, whether it's emissions trading schemes or whether it's renewable energy target, what we've had is unstable and unpredictable policies. So where we go from that, I think, is an important challenge. The thing that really struck me when I was looking at some of this stuff recently is, and I tend to be struck by charts and numbers, I suppose, as much as most people, is this. Firstly, and Shaylee may refer to this, is that the whole concept of the idea of a carbon budget. The world has a carbon budget, that is the total amount of greenhouse gases we can emit to maintain that 2-degree limit of global warming. And we've already spent half of it. That means we've only got another half to go, and the way we're going, it'll all be finished in 2040. So everybody better start holding their breath on the 1st of January 2041, because otherwise we've got a problem. So there is an interesting challenge that emerges from that. And secondly, we've got a challenge. If the world continues the path we're on now, we're going to be in trouble. And just from an export earnings perspective, if the world does respond to this 2-degree challenge, which Australia has already committed to, both the current government and the previous Labor government, then you can see in the top left-hand chart what happens to our coal exports. They drop significantly. They drop from where they are now significantly, and that only happens, this 450 scenario, which is the 2-degree scenario, that only occurs, coal only retains that market share if 80% of all the coal-fired power stations in the world are running on carbon capture and storage by 2040. At the moment, as far as I'm aware, there is one power station running in that way in the world. So there's a challenge there as well, I suggest. And then, equally, our gas exports will be affected. So I think the challenge here is, even if you take a perspective about economic activity, there is a significant economic impact. So, opens up the question for our discussion tonight, and that what might Australia's fair share be? And you will see lots of discussion taking place over the next little while, which will argue that Australia has a particular national interest in the way we currently produce electricity, the way we currently generate electricity from coal, the way we export coal and gas, and therefore we should have special considerations. And equally, every other one of the close to 200 countries that will discuss how they should set targets will also have their own national interest argument. So the question of how national interest gets played out is important. So, with that introduction and this learning cartoon, I will pass over to Shayleen, as I said, is the Chief Executive of the Acting Chief Executive of the Climate Change Authority, and she will talk to you and explain the approach that they've been taking in the draft report, which some of you may already have read. Shayleen.
Okay, good. So good evening, everyone, and thanks very much to Grattan for the opportunity to present on the Climate Change Authority's Special Review Draft Report, and thanks for the kind words. That they were a nice start to the evening. So, having a little bit of trouble with the technology. Right, very good. There we go. So just a little bit of context to set the scene and to explain why the Climate Change Authority put out this report that we're discussing tonight. So the Minister for the Environment requested a special review, which is one of the things that our legislation empowers us to do. And that special review has 3 tasks, which are actually up on the board. Of course, the context for the special review was the discussions in the Parliament on the legislation to set up the Emissions Reduction Fund. But it's important to note that the terms of reference for the review are quite wide-ranging. They allow us to look at a range of factors and issues down the track. But the sequence is that there's the draft report that we've put out, I think it was last week, although it seems a lot longer ago now. And the reason we put that out a little earlier than we were originally scheduled to do was, as Tony mentioned, there is also a process being led by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which is also looking at targets for emissions reductions that Australia should take to the Paris conference. So they're two parallel processes, and there's some informal discussions between the two, which is keeping us abreast of the work that PM&C are doing, and vice versa. So this is the first phase of that review, which was looking, as I say, at the targets. The second is the draft report on whether Australia should have an emissions trading scheme. That's due by the end of November. And then a final report wrapping it all up together, and including the action or policies that Australia should take to implement the outcomes of the Paris meeting, is due by June next year. So where we're up to at the moment is that we called for initial comments on the targets in February and received 24 submissions, and we're now welcoming submissions, and in fact encouraging submissions on the recommendations contained in this report. So I might move on to what the recommendations actually were. So the authority remains of the view that Australia should go beyond the minimum 2020 target of 5% below 2000 levels. And we're also of the view that the previous recommended 2020 target of 19% below 2000 levels remains appropriate. With respect to the 2020 and the post-2020 period, the authority recommends that the government should adopt a 2025 target of 30% below 2000 levels, and the authority believes that this is in line with what comparable countries are doing. We also recommended a trajectory range of 40 to 60% reductions in 2030, again below 2000 levels. And this range is quite important because it's designed to ensure that Australia can contribute its fair share to global efforts to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, but also providing some flexibility so that the government can respond to developments in climate change science, international action, or indeed things going on in the global or domestic economy. So what considerations did the authority use in terms of reaching these recommendations? And I think the first important point to note here is that it always starts with the science. The science, as we know, highlights Australia's exposure to climate change impacts and the need for robust global action to limit emissions. Science also points to the need to achieve an atmospheric concentration that can limit temperature increases to less than 2 degrees. And the question then arises as to what Australia's fair share of this global emissions budget should be. We also look at international action, and this has a number of components. So firstly, what have countries already done to reduce their emissions over the last couple of decades? And what are they pledging to do in the future? And then ultimately, what will all these efforts deliver in terms of a global carbon budget? And in this context, what would comparable targets and emissions budgets for Australia look like in 2020, 2030 and beyond? And then finally, the authority looks at the economic and social implications of the actions it's recommending for Australia. How can we minimise the costs of reducing our emissions and transforming our economy, particularly the all-important energy sector? So I'll talk a bit more about these broad considerations as I go through the presentation, and I'm sure that other points will be teased out in the discussion and questions. So this graph shows the 2025 target, and the trajectory needed to reach a 30% reduction in 2025 and the range for 2030. And it starts at the -5% starting point. It does show that if we start at the -5 point, that we'll need an annual emissions reduction after this point that's equivalent to 4.6% of 2010 levels. So I guess the point to note here is that if the government did decide to move beyond the -5 target, then you could have a more gradual rate of emissions reductions to 2030 and beyond. So Tony talked a bit in his opening remarks about budgets, and the authority considers that the emissions budget approach is the most useful form of long-term guidance because it links the cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases, which drive global warming and climate change, to people's budget share. So in the Targets and Progress Review, which was the previous big report, affectionately known as the BRIC in the Climate Change Authority, the authority estimated an Australian budget for between 2013 and 2050 of 10.1 gigatons. And the useful thing about budgets is that they highlight the trade-offs between actions now and those necessary later. They don't set specific pathways to meet the budget, but they do demonstrate that weaker action now leaves more emissions reductions work for the future. And the next few slides demonstrate this in hopefully a fairly graphic way. So this first slide is showing that, well, if you use the unconditional 5% 2020 target, then you've still got a fair amount of effort to do and go forward. And in fact, I guess the key point is actually you're burning through your budget in a way that doesn't leave a lot left for the later years of the time sequence. Oops, I'm going the wrong way there. So in fact, under this scenario, we would have used almost half of the budget in the years between 2013 and 2020, and a fairly small slice between 21 and 2025. So that's an effort to sort of show the budget in graphic terms. I mentioned earlier on that the authority was mindful of the targets and action that other countries have been taking. And this slide is intending to show that international action to address climate change is growing. So we see here the announced post-2020 targets of several developed and developing countries, and collectively the countries on this slide account for over half the world's emissions. More countries are expected to announce their pledges in coming months. So just to reflect on the recent history of some of these target commitments, in 1990 there were no international commitments to reduce emissions. By 1997, which of course was the year that the Kyoto Protocol was agreed, 37 countries had Kyoto targets. But by 2014, as a result of the Copenhagen and Cancun climate meetings, 99 countries had put forward pledges to reduce emissions. And these 99 countries cover more than 90% of the world's economy. So the comparable countries that people often look at, India, China, and compare those to what Australia might be doing, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Another common misconception is that countries haven't been taking their Kyoto targets very seriously, and this map is intended to show a rather different picture. So, of the 38 developed countries that took targets for the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, 36 countries met their targets according to initial evaluations. Of the remaining two, the US didn't participate in the treaty, and Canada withdrew after initially saying they would be part of it. But on the other side of the ledger, 36 countries remained in the Kyoto Protocol accounted for over 20% of global emissions in 2010. And the aggregate reduction on 1990 over the period was 24%, which was considerably better than the aggregate Annex B or developed country target that was actually the protocol was expected to deliver. So as I flagged, just wanting to look a little bit at what the United States is doing on climate action. One of the things that's often cited is the move to shale gas actually in the US, and how that's enabled the US to reduce its emissions considerably. That's certainly true, but in fact there's rather more going on in the United States than just that. So a range of state and federal policies have been put in place, including, most notably recently, the Clean Air Act rules to cut pollution from new and existing power plants. and these have been aligned with federal and state government incentives for renewable energy and electric vehicles, and also the ongoing work on mandatory emission standards for vehicles. In addition, of course, there's a range of emissions trading initiatives, including the state-based schemes, and as well there's renewable energy approaches in most states. So what about China? So China has committed to ensuring that its emissions peak by 2030 or earlier if possible, and to increase the non-fossil fuel share of all energy to around 20% by 2030. And China is the world's largest investor in renewable energy. There is also a raft of other policies which you see on the slide, and most notably, perhaps the 7 pilot emissions trading schemes and the undertaking to commence a national emissions trading scheme in 2016, which will be the largest trading scheme in the world. So, then looking at India, which is another, of course, major emitting developing country, they're expected to bring their 2020 pledge forward by September. It's expected that this will build on their existing national action plan but include some new initiatives. And one of the things that's quite, I think, remarkable is that their current installed renewable capacity is the 6th highest in the world, and there are plans to increase this many-fold by 2022. They also have an energy efficiency target, Perform, Achieve and Trade, which covers 25% of their GDP and about 45% of their primary energy consumption. So, in that context of growing global action and some serious efforts by some of the major emitting countries, where does Australia sit in terms of the targets that the authority has proposed for 2030 and beyond, and 2025 and beyond, rather? So when we're looking at countries' targets, the authority looks at 4 key criteria: capacity to reduce emissions, adequacy relative to global goals, responsibility to reduce emissions, and the effort required to meet the targets. And this slide looks at capacity particularly, and this is really about the country's wherewithal to reduce emissions, its wealth, its level of development, its governance and institutional capabilities, as well as the opportunities it has to reduce emissions, including what natural resources are at its disposal. And this chart shows 2 measures of capacity: GDP per person and ranking on the HDI, the Human Development Index, which is calculated by the UN and incorporates measures of income, health and education of people within a country. And Australia is represented by the blue dot, for those that might be finding the slide a little bit small. And it shows that on both these metrics, Australia is very well placed to reduce its emissions. So the authority also compares responsibility for global emissions. And this slide highlights 2 of the key criteria the authority used when comparing its recommended target with those of other developed countries. And the first is responsibility to reduce emissions, and this references Australia's absolute emissions, its per person emissions and its emissions intensity. So in this context, it's worth noting that Australia was, in 2010, was the 13th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. While its total emissions are about 1.3% of global emissions, only 7 countries have national emissions of more than 2% of the total. And Australia has the highest per capita emissions in the developed world. So we do have an emissions-intensive economy, and some of the debate around, or the commentary around the report has highlighted this, particularly relative to other developed countries. So the amount of emissions reductions that we would need to make, even if Australia meets the target that the authority has recommended, would still mean that we had one of the most emissions-intensive countries and economies in the world. So, moving next to compare reductions over time. Sorry, I've got ahead of myself. So this is another slide comparing responsibility and effort. So effort, I think, can be considered as relating to the adjustment task or the costs that people would need to bear to meet their targets. And as I alluded to earlier, Australia would face a bigger adjustment task and potentially higher costs to reduce emissions than many other developed countries. But I think it's important to note about costs that they depend very crucially on the policies that are put in place to help meet the target. And with efficient policies, the authority considers that Australia could achieve its recommended target at modest cost. So moving now to comparing reductions over time. So what this chart seeks to do is to look at both the reductions that countries have already achieved and delivered on, and the ones that are still to come, the ones in prospect that would derive from the new pledges or commitments that countries have been making to reduce their emissions in the lead up to the Paris conference. So the paler blocks are the changes in emissions as a result of these earlier efforts from 1990 to 2012, and the darker blocks show the future efforts that would be required under the new targets. So compared to some of the countries represented here, Australia has made relatively little progress to date in reducing overall emissions. The 30% target, as you can see, for Australia represents a broadly similar reduction to the EU and other European nations, although less than the UK and Germany, and would represent a greater reduction from 1990 levels than the US. And then, as I said, the lighter blocks, the darker blocks show where everyone would have to go to next to meet their 2025 targets. And just to note that where countries set 2030 targets, we interpolated a 2025 target. So this slide illustrates through the trajectories with targets for Australia, the EU and the US against an assessment of where developed countries as a group would need to be in 2030. And the yellow bar on my right is, and your right too, is from a European study which found that aggregate emissions from OECD countries will need to be between 33 and 74% below 1990 levels in 2030. So the chart shows how Australia, using the authority's recommended 2025 target, but starting from the current -5 target, the US and the EU are tracking towards this yellow range. And it does show, I think, very obviously that all three countries, in fact, will need to do a lot more to achieve that crucial 2-degree range. So we hear quite a lot of discussion about different base years in the current debate, and in fact Australia's targets are usually presented against a 2000 base year. And what this chart seeks to do is illustrate the authority's recommended target for 2025 against different base years. And I guess the take-home message here is that the amount of effort remains the same in terms of what the reduction needs to be, but the different base year can make the target look harder to achieve or bigger. So the blue line shows Australia's historical emissions. They fell after 1990. They actually peaked in 2005-06 and have fallen since then. So emissions do go up and down for a range of reasons, including economic growth, structural shifts in the economy, fuel prices, population growth, technology development, and consumer preferences all play a role. And of course, policies influence emissions, both climate policies and those that affect emissions-intensive activities. So, next steps. So the report is on the authority's website, and as I said earlier, submissions are welcome. That's the website address up there if you want to have a look at the report and to find out how to make a submission, or you can simply email us a submission at the email address on the screen. So once we've worked our way through the consultations and other discussions around the report, the authority may decide to make a further statement on the report. But as I said earlier, the second draft report on emissions trading schemes and other policies is due to be completed in November this year, with the final report being done at the Paris conference in June 26, after the Paris conference in June 2016. And the idea is that that recommends the sorts of actions Australia will have to do, picking up the outcomes from that Paris meeting.
Slideshow. Okay. There we are. Yeah. Oh, gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Shailene, and thank you, Tony, and thank you, Grattan, for the invitation to come along tonight and the kind introduction. Tony's asked me to run through a bit of the international context for what Australia, the decision that Australia will make later in the year. But given the time constraints, I won't go into detail too much about who the Institute is. I'm assuming most of you who know who we are. But the key things I wanted to really focus on in terms of the international context for Australia's target setting process I've outlined here. And the first being that we've heard a bit of conversation already tonight about the 2-degree goal. This was came out, really was driven by the Europeans, and it's probably one of their most successful climate policy, foreign policy objectives and successes over the years, where they've got this 2-degree goal entrenched in global agreements on climate change. The first being the Cancun Accords, then formalised within the UNFCCC process in Cancun. The important thing to say about this is that while I've got up here 2 degrees, and that's the one that's commonly talked about in the conversation, in Australia and in most advanced economies, most countries think that's too high. You have at the moment a review going on in the international process to look at about strengthening this goal to 1.5 degrees. And if you just looked at the numbers of countries who support the 1.5 degree to the 2-degree goal, you see about 2/3 of countries support 1.5 and 1/3 only support 2. So through time, I think there'll be an ongoing conversation about whether the 2 degrees itself is inadequate. But in some respects, in terms of the target setting process and international expectations, it doesn't matter. This is the international benchmark that has been set. Australia has formally agreed to that through those agreements I mentioned, but importantly in Lima last year, countries set out what upfront information countries needed to come forward when they justified their targets to the international community. And key amongst that was countries providing information to the international community that show how their target is a fair and ambitious contribution to avoiding or achieving the objective of the Convention, which is effectively avoiding a 2-degree increase in temperature. We've now, all from the INDCs or the post-2020 targets that have already come forward, and Shailene's run through those, we've seen all the other countries do that. So the US have justified their target against a 2-degree goal, the Europeans have, the Swiss, the Norwegians and other countries we would normally compare ourselves to are justifying their target versus that goal. So that's the first thing to say, and that's important in terms of the ongoing architecture I'm going to talk about. The other thing is that the Australian target isn't going to happen in isolation. So what we've had in the past in international agreements and target setting processes is a pattern of 2 things. One is whether it be the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period or the agreements that were put into the Cancun agreements, was they were sort of one-off targets or short-lived targets. We haven't really had an enduring international architecture which all countries are signed up to where they're advancing targets in some form of binding way. And this time round it will be different. I think all major players in the conversation want to establish a framework post-Paris which is enduring. which doesn't just see one target being set, then we come back a few years later to negotiate another round. I think what countries are looking for out of Paris is a framework which is enduring and drives progressive and ever-increasing action through time. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. So when we think about our target, we can't only be thinking about what happens in 2025 or 2030. We need to be thinking that we are going to have to come up with a target after that is going to be stronger than the next one. We're going to have to come up with a target after that which is stronger than the next one. And every time we do that, it's going to be need to be justified against the global goal. The other thing that's changed a lot over the last few years has been, as Shailen's already mentioned, many more domestic policies are being implemented around the world. That's happening regardless of what's happening in the UNFCCC negotiations. I do remember very clearly the Chinese Premier in Copenhagen saying, we will get on and meet this target regardless of what the rest of you do. And they're doing it. And they're doing it for lots of reasons, climate change only being one, but they're still getting on with it. So what we're seeing around the world is countries implementing domestic policies to drive clean energy, improve energy productivity and energy efficiency, and directly limit emissions. And they're all having effectively the same outcome, which is a global boom in renewable energy. We saw again last year, that total installed capacity in renewable energy at a global level again was more than total installed capacity in fossil fuels last year. So we're seeing an ongoing trend which is being driven by these domestic policies. In the international context, that's really important because countries generally only commit to targets if they think they're going to achieve them. So by having domestic policies in place that allow you and give you the confidence that you can achieve your target, countries are more likely to be ambitious in what they do. The other thing I think is important, and I'll bring it back into the domestic context for a second, is that the discussion around the post-2020 target is a really important one for Australia. We've been arguing over the scraps of policies in Australia for the last 12 or 18 months, I would probably characterise it as. So we've been talking about how we're going to meet a very inadequate and woeful 2020 target of a 5% reduction. We've been talking about the scraps of a renewable energy target, and we haven't been talking about how we're going to decarbonise our energy system overall and how we're going to achieve the long-term goals that we need. And I think the post-2020 target conversation is an opportunity for us to start doing that again. It's basically to get back to basics. What are we really trying to achieve and what are we really trying to do? And how are we going to do it? So what does all this mean for our target in terms of the international context? So what I've tried to illustrate here is the point I was trying to make, is that the agreement we see in Paris is likely to be a combination of what's generally called a top-down framework and a bottom-up framework. So what we're going to see from the top down is this ongoing international pressure for us to justify our target against the 2-degree goal. The other really important thing that was agreement in Lima last year, that every new target is a progression from the previous undertaking. So it effectively needs to be stronger, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. And it won't. And what countries are seeking to do there is ensure that we don't just have special pleading. I've been through many of these processes, and I saw that it was just watching the countries come forward in Bonn in advance of the Copenhagen conference, and one country after another said, it's really hard for us. It's really, really hard for all these different reasons. And Australia said it because we dig up lots of fossil fuels and sell them to other countries. Japan said it because we're really efficient already. And there is some justification in that. But it's not just about special pleading anymore. You've got to justify your target against these other things, which I think is an important evolution in the framework internationally. The other thing that we're going to see is it's likely that the targets themselves, when they're finally attached to the Paris outcome, will not be binding, but it will be binding that you have one. And there's also a chance that it will also be binding that you implement domestic policies to achieve them, a bit like the Chemical Weapons Convention does. And that's, again, important, as I already talked about, where you have this bottom-up pressure coming from domestic actions that build ambition, trust and confidence. Because as countries see other countries taking more action, they themselves will feel more confident that they can. And this is where Australia also has a particularly important role. Tony talked a bit about our unique circumstances, and that's actually, in some respects, can be an important gift to the world. Like have traditionally been a resource extractive nation, but there are other resource extractive nations who are much poorer than us that are looking for development analogues. And if we can show that we can do it as a high per capita emitting country, then that will give confidence to countries like South Africa and Brazil that they can actually go along a similar pathway and reduce emissions while maintaining their economic growth. But the real point I wanted to make here is that the pressure is going to come from two ways. It's going to come from domestic policies that continue to drive investment, but it's also going to come from top-down expectations, and we're going to have this ongoing cycle of keep coming back. So we have a target of 2025, then we have a target of 2030, we have a target for 2040, 2050, and at some point we're going to have to get to net zero. So the pressure isn't going to go away. The other thing I wanted to quickly talk about was progression. Now this was again another important thing that was agreed in Lima last year, where countries need to be progression from their previous undertaking. Now if I was the government, and heaven forbid that they would do this, well, how I would define progression is we can do a 7% reduction by 2025. That's stronger than a 5% reduction by 2020. And I wouldn't be surprised if they try and do that. However, progression isn't only about the scale of your target. What we're actually also seeing now from countries as we've got here is the rate of emission reduction that countries are undertaking is accelerating. And for Shailene's benefit, I've put a little star where the Climate Change Authorities one would be on here as well. So what we're seeing is that progression is just not having a bigger target, it's progression towards the 2-degree goal, but it's also a progression in the pace in which you're undertaking your action. And you can see here that the US is increasing its action significantly, the Europeans are, the UK. I've stuck up Japan's probably going to announce its draft target tomorrow, so I've stuck up what they're probably going to do. And then probably the exception of Norway, who I think made a mistake in setting their own target. They're probably the exception to this rule, but most countries are significantly increasing the pace of the action that they're taking. So what are the key things that we think about when we're setting a target? And some of this has already been touched on. One is vulnerability to climate change. It is in our national interest to get the most effective and strongest national response, as Tony's already talked about. But the key thing from an Australian government point of view is that the approach that the government, no matter what its colour is over the years, has always taken is that our goal is to maximise participation. So we want to get as many countries in, which is absolutely right. We do need to get as many countries into the agreement as absolutely possible. But if you take the view that 2-degree matters to us, then it's not just about participation that matters, it's also the ambition that those countries are taking that matters. I've already talked about the top-down, bottom-up expectations, but that's important because countries are making their own nationally determined targets, they're setting them in a bottom-up way, effectively. The norms that are set internationally by that are going to be set by national governments. So if Australia wants to achieve a 2-degree outcome, it itself needs to come forward with a 2-degree target. Unless we actually start creating expectations and norms internationally and strengthening those, then we're not going to get what we need, which is warming below 2 degrees. So through time we need to build that. So coming forward with a target that is consistent with below 2 degrees becomes the norm, not the exception. The other thing I'll quickly touch on is that, which Anthony's, sorry, not Anthony, slip of the tongue there, Shailene has already touched on, is that we're also going to hear a lot about the national impacts of our targets in a little while, as the debate heats up, no doubt. But I think it's important to reiterate that the net benefit and cost of action on climate change by a country is not determined by its target. It's fundamentally determined by the policies put in place to achieve it. You can put in place policies to achieve emission reductions really expensively, or you can put in place policies to achieve emission reductions really cheaply. You can also put in place policies to shield your trade-exposed industries, as we've done in the past, from action. So there's a range of things that you can do to manage any costs that you may be concerned about, but they give note that, but the scale of the target, you shouldn't weaken your target to try and manage those costs. You should define your policies to do that, not your target. The final point that I probably want to consider when we set our target is decarbonisation. I think is inevitable. While it's not going fast enough, it's happening. The climate, political, technological trends are all heading in the one direction. And if we want to create an energy policy, for example, that is stable in the long term, we need to recognise that and design a policy to do that, because otherwise we're going to keep coming back to it. And you can already see this with the renewable energy conversation. So we haven't been able to land an outcome, and now we're already seeing one of the major political parties saying, okay, well, we're going to revisit that and think about what we're going to do post-2030, post-2020, sorry, and just think about how they can strengthen the target. So that shows you, that's an example of the kind of thing that we're going to continue to see until we actually start setting both major parties getting us on a pathway towards decarbonisation. So I'll wrap up there, but I think the key thing for me really is the national conversation about targets. It is an opportunity for us to do a reset. We've had a horrible political debate over the last, too long now, on this issue. Now it's a time to actually start to get a more sensible conversation about what we're doing in the longer term. And if we do that well, we can benefit ourselves and the generations that follow us. Thank you.
So what we're going to do now is I'm going to try and raise a couple of the issues and maybe a couple of comments in relation to what you've already heard for about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, and then turn it over to the audience for questions. That should give us plenty of time to hopefully tease out some of the issues and then provide the substance for the submissions that I'm sure you'll be flooding into Charlene's organisation. I guess one of the things I did want to raise, and that is this issue of, I guess, comparative effort or the cost or however you frame it, because already since Charlene, your organisation put out its report, its draft report, there's already been strong reactions from some various sectors saying that that's just going to basically send us all broke, it's going to shut down industry, etc., etc. In some cases, the cost for some specific industries, depending on policy, as Erwin said, might be quite considerable over time, depending on how we implement our policies. So clearly the debate's being set up already. The question of it, given that Australia does have that particular profile, and you made the point that it will cost us more than many countries because we are so high. How do you respond to that question, that this is going to cost us more than it's going to cost other countries, and therefore we have a special case?
Well, I think that Erwin's point that everyone's special is well taken. And in a previous life, I was one of the people sitting behind the Australian flag, and yes, it's absolutely the case that everyone's special. With respect to the costs, I think it's important to look at both sides of the equation. So yes, we are an emissions-intensive economy. We rely currently very highly on fossil fuel use. We export a lot in that regard. On the other hand, there are some very strong opportunities to reduce emissions, and that there's been any number of studies that have pointed out that emissions reductions can be achieved at fairly modest costs. That said, it is true that there will be costs, and one of the things that the people often focus on is what economists call the distributional impacts, and that's, I suppose, the point that the cost impacts affect different sectors and industries differently. In the report, the authority made the point that actually how you best address those sorts of issues is through the design of your policies themselves. Ultimately, the fact that the authority considers that the fact that Australia is, a high per capita emissions-intensive economy, doesn't mean we shouldn't be acting, because everyone in the world needs to act to achieve the global goal that we're aiming for.
I guess what surprises me a little in this discussion that doesn't get brought up in other issues from another context is that if we export, as we are, a major exporter of food, right? And if it turns out that some of the food we're exporting is contaminated, it's having a bad impact on other people, the first thing you do is stop. You don't get any chance to say, well, we've got special circumstances in which we should be allowed to continue to export poisonous food just because it's going to cost us more to shut down our poisonous food industry. So I'm not quite sure why people don't make that argument that we are doing things which is causing damage to the entire planet as a result of, not we personally, but the consequences of the stuff we export, etc., which is, we've had the benefit of all this arguably cheap coal and gas for many, many years. And now arguably the global community, together with us Australians, and we have to pay for this. So I'm not sure why that argument even gets any traction at all, but I guess it'll play out for a while yet, and the way things actually develop, because it seems to me to be quite a perverse argument that because it costs us more, clearly we're concerned about it, but why we should get any consideration for that? Well, that should almost be the reverse consideration, I would think.
But I think the other issue is that it's how you define the cost as well, because yes, when Charlene talked about, yes, compare us to other advanced economies in terms of what the modelling shows. If you believe what the models say, then it does look like it's more expensive for Australia. But if you compare us to the entire world, it's not. If you look at the costs associated with the Chinese decarbonising, for example, in these models, it's much more than it is for us, yet they're getting on and doing it. I think the other thing we need to be careful about with the cost estimate is that the cost of reducing emissions, or the aggregate impact on Australia's economy of reducing global emissions, is not only determined by what we do, which doesn't get brought out in the conversation around the economic modelling that's done very often, but because a proportion of that cost is driven by the actions of other countries. They don't buy as much coal, they don't buy as much X or Y, and that also needs to be considered. But I think from the international perspective, I think the people, when I talk to people about it, they think about why should we continue to subsidise you? You have not taken as much action as we have. Why should we continue to subsidise your bad behaviour?
Seems like a fair question, doesn't it? So do you think that, Charlene put up a lot of actions that countries are taking. One discussion, one point might be, well, the US isn't really serious. I mean, we've already seen a situation in which parts of the American Congress have said to other countries, well, the president can't speak on behalf of the country in this particular area. It sounds like an incredibly unusual thing for a Congress to say about their president, but that's what they seem to have done. I'm not sure that the Republican Party in the US would necessarily see the same targets that Obama's trying to put in place and may very well try and unwind some of those. And equally in China, many parts of China, the emissions are actually quite high on a per capita basis if you take them separately. So, and again, I've heard people suggesting that India has got a long way to go before they're really serious about those sort of targets. Now, there you've got 2 developing countries and 1 developed country. So, are you seriously expecting that countries will actually turn up by the middle of the year and then for Paris with numbers that will actually add up to 2 degrees? And if they don't, then what are the expectations that this time it will be different? Because it seems to me, you made that point, Erwin, that this time you're expecting it will be different for the reasons you mentioned, but I wonder whether it'll just disintegrate back into the same old again. So what might make this one really different if people just turn up with numbers that don't add up?
Because I think the core issue is if you look at the numbers that are being put on the table at the moment and the trajectory that we're not on a 2-degree trajectory. Certainly, we were, like the estimates last year, we were on a 4-degree trajectory. Now, with what the US and China have put on the table, they've probably knocked about a third of the gap off between the 4 degrees and the 2 degrees, which is not insignificant, but it's not enough. So I don't think anyone should expect Paris itself to deliver a 2-degree outcome. But that comes back to the role you see of an international negotiation. International negotiations don't reduce emissions. What decides whether we reduce emissions is the actions in national capitals and the policies that national governments put in place. So the role of the international agreement is to facilitate and increase the ambition of those actions. If we out of Paris can continue to see and put pressure on national governments that they live up to their 2-degree commitment, if we start to see a long-term credible framework which sends a signal to business and national governments that this issue isn't going to go away, we're going to continue to ratchet, that will put downward pressure. And if we don't lock in for long periods of time, targets to say 2030 but limit it to say 2025, then we're keeping open the option of the 2-degree, but we're also creating a framework which is going to increasingly put pressure on national governments to do more. And that's what we want in Paris. We don't want Paris to save the world. It's not going to save the world. What Paris is going to do is hopefully accelerate the already substantial action.
Right. And so when you look at, just for the way of clarity for those who may not follow some of that numbers that Erwin was talking about, I guess you're referring to the IEA put out its major report for the World Energy Outlook for 2014, which basically said if the world implements all the policies that had then been announced, this is back in the middle of last year, then we're on a pathway to 3.6 degrees. And they also suggested that we need to get to 2 degrees, and I understand that between now and the next month or so, the IEA will release an updated set of those projections of how we're now looking, and that will take into account the extent to which the commitments that China and the United States have made would be factored into those sort of projections. And I guess any other targets that have been announced in the time that's gone past since then. So the dynamic around this is the way this has got to work. Shane, you've been involved in this yourself as well. I mean, is our target, isn't it just an ambit claim? And we're just going to start from there and see how we go? Or do you think this now seriously is going to be a number that's going to be effectively, that's the number we're going to stick with? And what's going to be the dynamic of between now and Paris?
Look, I haven't been personally close to the negotiations for quite a while. Erwin's probably got more of a box seat in terms of what the expectations are. I mean, one of the things I have heard from many people, though, is that after the disappointing outcome in Copenhagen, that things are looking a lot more prospective this time. Look, I think the authorities' view has been that if Australia was to take on board this recommendation of the 2025 target and then find a landing spot by 2030 that's within the 40 to 60 range, that puts us on a pathway towards 2 degrees as a sort of a fair and equitable share of Australia. And I guess picking up on your point, Erwin, that the hope with Paris is that it puts globally the world on the pathway to 2 degrees, and even if we don't quite get there at Paris. And if I could just make one sort of personal observation, when I was doing the negotiations, a phrase you'd hear a lot was, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." And my own hope is that Paris finds a good outcome, even if it's not a perfect one.
And coming to the issue of whether the target is, is it locked in when the government announces it in June or July? Formally, no. These are intended nationally determined contributions. They're basically what countries do their initial offer. I think some countries will have more flexibility to change that than others. But what Australia's contribution ultimately will be determined not just by the government but also by the position of the ALP. And this is not just a question for how the government advances its target, but it's also a question for how the ALP responds to it. Because the worst case scenario would be that we have the government announces a poor target, and then that by default the ALP fall into that, and we have a bipartisan support for a poor target. The best outcome, of course, would be that they could both come to an agreement that we're both serious about avoiding 2 degrees and we'll both agree to a target and a policy to get there.
So just the other question I guess I had was, we talked or introduced the topic of the fact that there was the Prime Minister, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet is also doing a piece of work associated with setting targets, and they've had an issues paper out for a few weeks, and the submissions have closed, and I'm sure people in this room are part of organisations that have already made submissions to that activity. How do you see the two interacting with each other? Is there a formal or informal way in which they'll come together, or are they going to be fighting with each other, or is it a competition to see who gets the biggest target? How do you see that happening, Shayla? This is being recorded, but we won't send it to anybody else. All right.
Look. I think perhaps it's worth stepping back and just refreshing what the authorities' role is. We have a legislative role to provide, in effect, policy advice to the government. We're doing that through the special report. The government governments can take policy advice from a whole raft of different people and processes. In this case, they've set up the process that the PM&C task force is leading. On an informal basis, we talk to them and they talk to us. So there is, I guess, some cross-pollinisation of ideas and so on. At the end of the day, it will be up to the government how it chooses to reconcile the various pieces of policy advice that it gets on these and other issues to do with addressing climate change.
It seems like the Climate Change Authority has an interesting history where the government set it up, and then every time it does something, it gets something else in opposition to it. So, and when you had the renewable energy target process, and the Climate Change Authority had the job of doing it last year, and the government set up a separate process called the Warburton Review to do another review of exactly the same thing. So maybe there's a message there about the way they tend to do reviews with the Climate Change Authority. Okay, look, it's about 7:30, which means we've got a good half hour of discussion. I've got quite a few questions here that I can throw to both Erwin and to Shailene, but why don't we start and give you an opportunity to answer some questions. We do have microphones, I think, on momentarily on both sides, and I think at the very back there was a gentleman who had his hand up very quickly indeed, or a lady, I can't. And if you could, it would be useful if you could indicate your name, and if you are here representing an organisation, if you could indicate that affiliation as well, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jane Morton, and I'm from Victorian Climate Action Network and a number of grassroots groups that put in a submission to the post-2020 target. David Spratt's people who are handing out at the door. It seems to me that one of the important things about specifying a carbon budget is that you need to specify the probability that you're willing to accept it exceeding 2 degrees. So one of the diagrams in here is indicating that for a 90% chance, our carbon budget is already zero. It seems to me that specifying the probability is a really key part of specifying anything about what we're going to do, and it's a real problem with the international agreement that doesn't specify the probability that is acceptable of exceeding the target. First of all, do you agree that we've got zero carbon budget left for a 90% chance?
At the moment, most of our discussions has been around the 2 degrees, although when you raised the issue of whether or not we should have a more aggressive target of 1.5. Do you want to comment on that issue of should we think about targets in a slightly broader sense? Shailene, is that part of your remit, or have you looked at that issue?
So what the authority did with the draft review report was, I guess, really backed off the work that had been done previously in the targets and progress review, and that it did through that process settle on the view that it thought that 67% chance of reaching 2 degrees was appropriate, and then did its work to identify a fair and equitable share for Australia of the 10.1 gigatons that I talked briefly about earlier. So look, I understand and respect the view that that a 90% chance would be better. That's not the position that the authority reached in the targets and progress review. But I certainly understand why people feel that they want a higher degree of certainty than the 67% that the authority has been working off.
The actual calculation is based on Australia's per capita share. I mean, basically, you've taken the global carbon budget, and and your allocation to Australia is based upon what our per capitas, our number of heads that we'll have in 2050 or something. How does that work?
So it's a modified per capita convergence approach, and it was first identified and really articulated in the Ghana review of a few years ago. And basically what it does is say, okay, well, let's start with the per capita emissions that countries have now, and let's converge to a lower and universal set of per capita emissions. Where the modified bit comes in is it does recognise that a number of the rapidly industrialising developing countries need a bit of headroom to allow their emissions to grow before they begin the work of contracting their emissions to meet that per capita level that everyone would need to meet.
So effectively, by the time we get to this destination, we've got everyone basically is working on the same emissions per capita in the world.
Equal rights to the global budget, in effect.
Okay.
But I would note that how you allocate a carbon budget is a moral and ethical question. It's not a scientific one in some respects. And the budget that the authority uses is very generous to Australia. If you ask a Chinese negotiator whether that's a fair budget, I'm fairly sure he will give you a rather different answer.
Right. Down here, I think. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much. Fiona Armstrong from the Climate and Health Alliance. I've got a question and a comment about emissions reduction targets and also the 2-degree goal. And I guess that goes a little bit to the point that Jane is making about the likelihood of achieving that. So the CCA has a 30% by 2025 target, and Grattan, I understand, has announced a 15 to 20% by 2025 target. And just to make the point that the evidence is that we are already out of step with the rest of the world. We've seen tonight that current policies put us on track for 4 degrees. And our existing emissions and the climate change that they cause are already extremely harmful to health. The 2 degrees cap is dangerous, and as we've heard, the 1.5 degree, 1.5 degrees is supported by a majority of countries. So Erwin, you said the difference between the two doesn't really matter, but I would argue that the difference is a massive human cost. The difference is thousands of deaths, destruction of livelihood, settlement, displacement and conflict that will arise from that warming. As Shailene said, Australia clearly has responsibility and capacity to meet the targets that the CCA's outlined. And why would Grattan propose lower targets than the CCA? And I'd be interested to hear a few more comments about the 1.5 target.
Do you want to go first, and I'll come back to Luke?
When I say talk about the difference between 1.5 and 2, the reason I say it doesn't matter, I said it was in the context of how other countries will be looking at and Australia justify its contribution. Of course, it matters in terms of the long-term impact. The other thing I'd note is that if you look at like the way we think about this is in terms of the probabilities that people have already raised is not just whether the budget gives us a reasonable chance of avoiding 2 degrees, and you can argue about what's reasonable, but does it actually leave open the chance of avoiding 1.5? And that's why we have recommended a stronger budget than the Climate Change Authority, for example, because it leaves open the opportunity to achieve 1.5. And unfortunately, all the models that we have, the best chance we've currently got of that is 50-50. Even if we were as aggressive as we absolutely could be, we've got a 50-50 chance of avoiding that 1.5. But that's an option we think it's worth going for. But the short-term actions to achieve 1.5 and 2 degrees are actually pretty similar. The emission trajectories that you would get to achieve a 1.5 goal or a 2 degree goal are much the same. The big difference is after 2050, where for a 1.5 degree temperature goal, you need to have massive amounts of negative emissions. We need to be drawing very large amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere. So that's the really big difference between the emission profiles of those two scenarios.
I guess in terms of the 2025 target, the important issue, it seems to me, is to, for God's sake, create some momentum in this country towards serious abatement. And what worried me about the maths, the way the Climate Change Authority has calculated its 2025 target, I wouldn't in any way try to refute at all. I think that's the maths work, as Shailene described, perfectly well, and you end up with the number you end up with. The question is, are we likely to see that given the particular political situation we have in Australia? And it may be a pathetic excuse for a political situation we have in Australia, but that's where we are. So the question I had then was, well, if we're seriously going to try and do this, then isn't it really the first thing to do is create some momentum beyond 2020? Because we've had a long and painful debate, which we ended up with a 5% target. Can we create some momentum? And 15-20% seems like we actually could, if we could get bipartisan support of the sort that Erwin was talking about towards that target. We know it's going to have to be ratcheted up, and because it is a lesser target than the 30%, it will have to be ratcheted up faster later. That is a consequence of doing less sooner. If we'd had a better target than 5%, as Shailene said, we wouldn't need as an aggressive target as 30%. But if we have a lesser target than 30%, we'll do more later. It seems to me, given where we are in the current political debate in this country, the chances of pushing for the 30% are hard and may very well be so polarised as so we don't get anywhere. So if we could start by getting 20% on the table, it seems to me that would at least create some momentum to then go harder later. That's the only way I think you can justify that sort of outcome. So, any other questions? You're right there, just Alex, I think.
John Hogan, representing myself. Explain to me whether a worldwide trading system, or emission trading system, would that give a much more cost-effective solution to climate change? If you set a particular number, you then look wherever you can in the world to get the cheapest way of delivering it.
Either of you want to start with it?
Well, the short answer is yes. So one of the things that the authority has said in both its early reports and this one is that with access to international permits through the sort of international trading that you're talking about, it's a way of achieving targets that can be considered on the ambitious side without imposing big costs. And you're exactly right that sort of arrangement allows the global economy, if you like, to find and use the cheapest abatement options through international trade. The corollary to the points about international units, though, is that the authority also believes that it is necessary to strike a balance between taking advantage of these low-cost opportunities in other countries, but also finding ways to affect the sort of transformation of our own economy so that we decarbonise, and in particular with respect to power generation and heavy industry. So that leads you to the view that you can't really do it all through international permits. You do need to ensure that you're doing some of the transformation through your the changes you make at home.
Well, the short answer is no. So Shailene and I had to disagree on something tonight.
And you promised.
No, seriously, I think broadly speaking, I agree with what Shailene said. I think that there's a caveat I'd stick on it, in that the way that we sometimes, or those global markets are communicated, assumes that we have an optimal world where people are rational, that businesses and any global carbon market will set a forward trajectory of price which is consistent with 2 degrees, and we'll all get on and do our job, and those prices, we'll see those prices and we'll get on and make investments on that basis. That's not how the real world works. So I think when we're designing policy, yes, we do need access to international markets, and one of the things we've said in our submission to the Prime Minister's task group is that the target that is set should be a net target. So that includes domestic action and access to international units. But at the same time, we also need to recognise we're in a suboptimal world. So if you're in a suboptimal world, how do you manage risk? And a way to manage risk is have those kinds of policies, but also to make sure that you're decarbonising, as Shailene said, your major emitting sources, so that you're not racking up and putting money on your credit card as opposed to paying it off. So you need to actually get on and actually do things at home as well.
Okay, next. That was just right there.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Stephen Pollard, also representing myself. I note that the Australian government has said already, and it's quite clear, that the emissions reduction task for 2020 has sort of dropped substantially since the target was first set, due to a whole lot of things like action by individuals putting solar panels on their roof, and terms of trade changing, and global finances and so on. I guess my interest is if we were to set a national policy in Australia's side and look at some of those more local actions and factors along with the sorts of policies that some states are putting in place in terms of renewable energy emission reduction targets, how far would that get us towards the sorts of targets that you've both talked about tonight? And how important is it to have that national policy setting in terms of providing certainty and driving sort of sustained and progressive emissions reductions over a long period?
So I think I understand the question to be, what if the state governments go ahead and put their own policies in place to achieve emissions reductions? Is that what you meant, or?
Partly, if we ignored the federal government, could we do this ourselves?
Depends who we is, I guess.
Well, certainly there's a lot of history in Australia of the state governments doing just that, and some years ago the states worked together to propose a national emissions trading scheme. So I think there's been a lot of action at state, and also some initiatives at local government. It goes a little bit to the point I was trying to make earlier about costs being very dependent on the sorts of policies you put in place. And one of the issues people sometimes raise about state governments putting in place policies is that they can work out over the longer term to be more costly, because you get different approaches to the same sorts of things in different jurisdictions, which means that companies that have to comply across a number of different jurisdictions have to bear different sorts of transaction costs and reporting requirements and all that sort of thing. So I think perhaps as a Commonwealth public servant, I would take this view. But I think there are some advantages to national approaches in terms of lowering administration and other transaction costs. But certainly it's possible.
I think there would be already, people I'm sure in this room would know that there's been some changes of government at the state level in the last, since the current federal government was elected. And some of those state governments are making noises in that very direction. So whether they're talking about having state-based climate change targets or state-based renewable energy targets, that may very well come out of as much out of state government frustration as it might come out of individual frustration. The real question is, can those things be effective, or does the whole thing become horribly mangled and we end up with a complete dog's breakfast, as people might describe it? But I mean, your organisation has been one of those that's taken a pretty high profile, I guess, at an activist level. What is the role of the, maybe you go back the other end, the grassroots organisation? Because many people here, I'm sure, belong to organisations that are wondering, what can we do at the community level to try and influence this discussion? What would your advice to those groups be?
I think that I was thinking about this before, because one of the things that often gets lost in the conversation when we have about this, and I'm much to blame for this as anyone else, because I talk a lot about Paris and all those kinds of things, we sort of we get held hostage to what others are doing, or whether it be an international process or to what the Americans are doing or the Chinese are doing. But at the end of the day, there's two words in what we've got to announce this year, which are really important and are nationally determined. So each country has to make its own decision about what it thinks its fair share should be and how ambitious it should be, and that is a decision that's made in Canberra. So I think that's why we've got to, in some respects, got to stop thinking about, okay, in some respects it actually doesn't matter what other countries are doing. What matters is what we as a country want to do. And certainly everyone, I think, has a role to play in that conversation, whether you be in business or whether you're a local activist. It's actually what is in the long-term interest of our country, and make sure that all political parties and your energy company or your bank or whoever you want to influence hear your view on that. Because and it's been interesting, like I've been working on climate change now for over 20 years, and it is actually probably now one of the most exciting times we've ever been in. Like if someone had said to me 5 years ago that China was going to have an emissions trading scheme and that the global divestment movement would be growing faster than the apartheid movement was, then I would have laughed at them.
It's at least positive anyway. Okay, right up the very back on this corner, I think, yes.
Frank Marlowe, talking for myself. One of the issues that has concerned me greatly is the issue of measurement of what you are doing. So, for example, if you're talking trading certificates and trading systems, as I understand it, a lot of the offsets will come from agriculture and forestry, and a lot of that is coming from countries which are corrupt and where it is very difficult to measure. So you end up with a whole series of fraudulent certificates which in fact do not reduce the CO2, and you have huge expenses that are going through there. And when I look at the systems that I hear proposed, I do not see how you are accurately measuring rather than just taking a deemed amount of reductions. And I think it's a serious flaw in almost everything that I've heard to date.
So look, the concerns you raised, I think, are the concerns that a lot of people have working in this space. And you're right, the land sector does pose some particular challenges for estimating carbon abatement. In fact, my understanding is that the primary source of international permits in developing countries is the Clean Development Mechanism, and there's actually very few opportunities under that mechanism for land-based carbon credits. There's some forestry projects, but they're very small in number, and as far as I know, there aren't other agricultural land-based abatement opportunities that people are trading. My knowledge could be a little out of date on that. Certainly, Australia wrestled with these problems very seriously when the Carbon Farming Initiative was put in place. And we were fortunate because in Australia we have, a strong system of governance, and the CFI is a legislated scheme. And it backs off the national inventory and accounting system that Australia's used for many years. The approach that Australia has taken and a number of other countries have taken, including some developing countries now, is to accept that going out and measuring the carbon in every bit of soil or slapping a tape measure around every tree is just, as you say, not feasible. And there's a lot of effort that's being put into ensuring that modelled approaches are robust and ground-truthed. So I probably have a little more optimism than you do, that there are ways that this sort of abatement can be estimated and quantified and then traded. But you're exactly right, it does rely on very strong governance arrangements. My own view is it's probably best done on the basis of a legislative scheme. But the IPCC, who we talked about earlier, in terms of putting out these very important state of the science reports and also advising on what global carbon budgets should be, also have another role that they perform, which is issuing what's known as best practice guidance for inventories and emissions measurement, including on the land sector. And all developed countries use those for preparing their national inventories, which they report to the UN every year. And in fact, they're sort of the gold standard of how countries measure and estimate these things. So there's a lot of international work and effort that's put into them, and an effort that's been going on for many years.
Behind you, Alex, this one just...
Thanks. I'm Richard Keith from BZE. In measuring our emissions, how is it we can get away with using 100-year global warming potential measurements for methane when we don't have 100 years to fix this? My understanding is that the 20-year time horizon global warming potential is 4 times the number that is used in our accounting of carbon. So doesn't that call into question the integrity of the CO2e measurements overall?
Do either of you want
So
to... the issue is...
I'm not sure, but it sounds like you might be reflecting on the change to the permanence obligation that the government brought in. No,
this is the global warming potential of...
Yeah, so I'm not sure about the four times and the 100 years.
Using the shorter time horizon measurements for methane in accounting for methane fugitives, which would, I think, have the effect of making our measured emissions much greater than they would appear to be today.
Did you want to... So the global warming potentials are, again, some of the guidance that the international community and the IPCC puts out. And as you say, it's about the radiative forcing that you would get from a tonne of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and methane is actually 25 times that. So the global, the radiative forcing effect of methane is actually recognised through these international accounting as many times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So I'd be very, I think maybe we're not quite connecting on what the issue you're wanting to discuss is, so I'm very happy to talk to you some more about it afterwards, if that would help.
Yep. And just over here, I think, yes.
I just wanted to touch a little bit on the Australian political situation about how we get these targets in place and then how we seek to achieve them. My name's Matt, I'm from a group called the Labour Environment Action Network, and so we're an internal lobby within the Labour Party. And I just wanted to know really, what can the Labor Party do? Oh, by the way, leading into the national conference this year, we have a campaign to adopt the targets that the CCA set and also the Climate Works targets in terms of renewable energy. But in us reaching that target, we need to justify to the party and to the conference how can we make the impacts both in terms of cost of living and in terms of employment more palatable to the electorate going into the next election.
You got that one?
Give that one a go.
Well, making it more palatable is difficult. I think I'll just make a comment on the nature of the debate in recent times. The first is don't lead with your chin. I think one of the mistakes that the previous government made was it talked about a mechanism as opposed to an outcome. Because the outcome we actually want is lower levels of pollution and we want to avoid climate change. And I think that's where we've got to have the conversation. Then you can get into the mechanism, inevitably you'll get into the mechanism conversation after that. I think in terms of the cost of living questions, it's a difficult one because there will be people out there who scaremonger, and there's no doubt about that. We've seen that for over the last 2 or 3 years. We know the costs are manageable with the appropriate policies, and we also know that there are benefits associated with those policies. So I think when I talk to the community about this, and I talk to the Labor Party about this, and I talk to the Coalition about this, I just always come back to some central things that, basically this change is inevitable. We can do it the easy way, we can do it the hard way. The easy way is to start now and get serious about it. The hard way is to wait. Because if we wait, it's going to be much more difficult. In terms of but there is a broader issue, I think, about how we manage the transition. Because there are certainly communities, like if you think of the Latrobe Valley or up in the Hunter where they've got coal-fired generators, we do need to exit those very old coal-fired generators relatively quickly. And I think we've seen some good signs from some of the energy companies recently recognising that. So let's have a conversation about how we do that with those communities as well. The risk with doing that is that they've heard it all before. So they actually need some credible signals from government that this is actually really going to happen. And that'd be, in some respects, the worst thing for them if we keep flip-flipping on it.
I guess one of the things about this, and people, I guess all three of us here, and Shailene and Ewan more than I, have been involved in this debate for quite some time, and you need to get disillusioned by some of it. You may lose some of your ambition, but I think when you get at the extremes of things, then you're almost inevitably going to fail because you just won't carry the electorate with you, right? So one of the issues is to really develop the arguments, the fundamental narrative around why this is a thing that needs to be done, and there will be ways in which it's going to cost, and I don't think you can shy away from that. I think those who suggest it's going to be cost-free and it's going to be paying less and that there won't be losers as well as there'll be winners are kidding themselves and will be caught out on that. Equally, I forget the name of the particular comedy that I remember watching not very long ago, and these guys were gathered on Saturday night on top of the mountain, and they were talking about the fact that the world was going to end at midnight that night. And they were just discussing what the consequences, what the world was like and how bad it was, but it was going to end at midnight. And when the midnight came and went and the world hadn't ended, they all just packed up and went back and said, we'll see you next Saturday night. If you start creating that wrong narrative, you only have to see what happened in Australia very recently when organisations and companies were saying to the New South Wales government, you need to let us develop coal seam gas because we're going to run out of gas. And then only a month or so later, the Australian Energy Market Operator says, oh, by the way, we're not going to run out of gas. So making those sort of threats and raising those sort of profiles equally loses the debate politically. So I think the issue is how do you start to have that narrative to make sure that people don't think it's going to be either we need to do this tomorrow, otherwise the sky is going to fall, because most likely it won't, I suspect, and equally arguing this is all going to be happy and we're just going to basically wander off into the future. Singing together isn't going to be the answer either. But the real problem I think we've had is our political leadership have just lost that narrative to put to the population of what this is all about and what the choices are. that we need to make in this country about how we're going to move forward on this. And I think, sadly, that happened with the Labor Party, and it's certainly a current issue within the Liberal Party, because even within the Liberal coalition, there are many people who A, absolutely understand this stuff, and B, are as committed to trying to do something about it as many people in this room are. The problem is they haven't got the ear of the wider electorate, and I think that's where organisations like yours have to try and do something. We need to ask one last question, I think, because we are running out of time, Lane.
Hi, Lane from Pacific Hydro. And just to sort of follow on with that question a little bit and talk about, we seem to get caught up in this cost to transition. And it appears to me that there's always a cost, but it never takes into account the net benefit. So there's very credible economic analysis coming out of the US, for example, that shows or demonstrates that the societal cost of the coal-fired power generation sector there is actually net negative. So there's cost to society, the damage, the health and environment damage actually exceeds the economic benefit of the jobs and the electricity that's produced. So I guess the question, Shailene, to you is as a climate change authority and trying to do that sort of assessment of targets and impacts and the like, is the authority looking to move to looking at the net economic impacts in the future?
So that's a very good question. We didn't say an awful lot about costs in this current report, partly because it's this position that the authority has put forward that the costs are very contingent on the sorts of policies you choose to implement to achieve your targets. And actually, I think that it's in some ways quite a useful circuit breaker to step back from the debate about costs and policies and actually just look at the goal and the objective of what we're trying to achieve, because as we've been alluding to, there's been any number of debates and discussions over the last probably 2 decades about what the best policies are and what the cost should be. So the authority will be looking at policies and the impacts of those policies in its next report. So that will be part of the mix of what people are looking at. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, Erwin, do you want any final comments this evening? Are you done?
I'm done, I think. But yeah, no, I'm done.
Great. Shailene? That doesn't happen very often, I can assure you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to let everyone know that I'm sitting here shivering with cold, not sort of stark terror. So you've been a great audience. Thank you for all the engagement.
Okay, so we'll let everybody head off. Just a couple of comments from me finally is to firstly say thank you for coming along this evening to be part of this discussion. Without an audience, it'd be a bit boring. It keeps the room maybe slightly warmer as well. The room is warmer as well, the more people we have here. We have recorded this tonight, and if any of you know people who haven't seen it but would have liked to have come this evening, please suggest to them they'll be able to get access to it. And particularly importantly, I encourage you, if any of you got any particular suggestions to the draft report that Shailene's talked about, make a submission. It doesn't have to be you don't have to respond to every point. You don't have to put in a 100-page submission. But if you've got any particular thoughts, please make those to Shailene. I'd like to thank the people who helped organise this, both the people in Shailene's staff, but also in Grattan Institute. Andrew McDonald is here this evening, and Alex Stott, who helped organise the event. And we are going to be intending to follow this discussion over the rest of this year and into next year. Clearly, there will be, as both organisations, the Prime Minister's Department and the Climate Change Authority, start to finalise their work, there may be an opportunity to have a similar discussion around how this is progressing. And equally importantly, as we start to turn to the domestic policy of how Australia will achieve whatever target we agreed to between now and the end of the year, what sort of domestic policy we should do there. We'll almost certainly be having similar events. So look out for those events. Please join us for that occasion. And again, please join me in thanking both Shailene and Erwin. Thank you.